I'm your host, Hillary Bricken, and this is the Cannabis Law Now podcast, where we regularly discuss issues related to the cannabis industry, including investment, day-to-day operational issues, and potential reform on the horizon that will impact all cannabis businesses and investors in the United States. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Cannabis Law Now podcast. Hope you guys have all been doing well. Today, we have a real treat. Something that's personally close to my heart is the building of brands in the cannabis space, because in my opinion, there's still a lot of room for improvement. Household names are starting to emerge, though, and I think today we have a representative of one of those potential names in Tiffany Chen, who is the CEO of Death Row Cannabis. And if you don't know Death Row Cannabis, I don't know what you've been doing, but it embraces the iconic stature, image, name, likeness of the great Snoop Dogg, who I personally love. He's a fantastic artist. I think he's done a lot to raise the visibility of the cannabis industry with his work and his brand. So I'm really, really glad to have Tiffany here today to talk to us about her role at Death Row, how it's gone, the highs, the lows, and really, I think, from the perspective of operations management, how to build and maintain a lasting cannabis brand. So Tiffany, welcome to the podcast.
So much. It's so great to be here, and I'm excited to chat about everything that you just mentioned.
Okay, well, and usually the audience probably knows this. I have some questions that I always ask our panelists, but it's very conversational, and feel free to share accordingly as we kind of go through these things. But the first thing I think our listeners would want to know, and certainly I want to know, give us a little bit about your background in business generally, and then specifically in the cannabis sector.
Yeah, sure. So I spent my early career doing some actuarial accounting consulting, which is as boring as it sounds. My most exciting engagement was with the Department of Labor. So that kind of shows you how exciting that job was. But I also had a stint at Target Corporate, which was actually help informed my current job a little bit in terms of buying, planogramming, in-stock spacings, and retail organization. So that was early on in my career. I actually took a leap and jumped into an internship in Los Angeles where I was making pennies on the dollar from what my previous job was giving me, just to get a taste of. I'd always had an affinity towards entertainment because I felt like even if the economy's not doing well, even if you're struggling as a family, entertainment is an inelastic service or good. Meaning, and when I say entertainment, I don't just mean TV, film, movies, but also music, video games, going to theme parks, sports, watching sports. All these things kind of fill up our lives and give us entertainment. And so I wanted to be in and around that world because the success of entertainment carries on, even if, the sentiment economically is not great, right? I ended up working at a boutique management firm that managed artists including Busta Rhymes, Snoop Dogg, Far East Movement, Macy Gray. And so the roster was super interesting to me because of the legacy, quote unquote, artists that I loved growing up with in the 90s and the 2000s. But then also they had Far East Movement, which if you can't tell by my last name, I am Asian. And it was really cool to see that they had the only all Asian group that has hit #1 on Billboard on their roster as well. So I just had this draw to this management company. And when I started, I was an intern, moved into business development. And then my boss at the time was like, hey, it's 2014. We just, Colorado and Washington just announced their legalization recreationally. We have to get into the space because we represent Snoop Dogg. And there's no one in this building who has a confluence of business acumen, but also smokes weed every day. There's one person in this building that does that, and it's you. And so here I am in my mid to late 20s being like, is this what I want to do? Like, what's the business trajectory here? Industry wise, is it still going to be around? And I'm really glad I took the leap because cat's out of the bag now, right? And you can't herd. I feel like it'd be a million cats back into one tiny. But I'm really glad that I did that back in 2015 and 16, respectively. We launched Snoop's original brand, which was called Leafs by Snoop, which was, LBS, which is supposed to be colloquially known as pounds, but that never took off, I think, due to some stylistic decisions, which is okay. But we were live in Colorado in 2015 and then in Canada a year later in 2016. And we did really great things there, I feel, in terms of opening up the possibility of celebrity endorsements as well as their own products. And then in 2020, I'm sorry, I know I'm going kind of long with my intro, but in 2020, I ended up having a baby. And so I took about a year off. And in that time, I really wanted to work from home. And so I ended up finding a job outside of entertainment, outside of cannabis, in one of my other passions, fitness. And about 4 days, the Thursday before I was supposed to start work on Monday, Snoop called me and was like, "Hey, what are you doing now? Would you like to come back? I know you left the management firm, but would you like to come work directly for me and run this portion of my business?" Unfortunately, I had to tell him no at the time because I had just signed a contract, but he said that he would continue contacting me every 3 or 4 months, and he did. And at about 9 months, he gave me the ultimatum, like, "It's okay if you don't want to come back, but I do have to look in earnest for someone else to fill this role if you're not coming back." And it was at that time that I was like, "Nope, don't do it. I'm coming back." That was back top of 2022. A year later, in top of 2023, we launched Death Row Records Cannabis, which is now live in Michigan, California, Ohio, soon to be in New Mexico, and then subsequently, hopefully 2025 in 2 more territories. And then we've also launched a different brand, which is actually from the legacy of Leafs by Snoop, called Dog Pounds, but it's spelled DOGGLBS. And so international communities and territories are not as okay with the words death or death row in their branding. If anyone in the industry knows, Health Canada is notoriously tough on branding, marketing, even colorways for their packaging. And so we had to do a different brand that would appeal more towards the international community. And so that's where the Dog Pounds brand comes in. And we're in Canada and Australia with that brand. So that's pretty exciting, but it is difficult to manage kind of 2 separate brands that kind of have a similar ethos. Um, but the benefit of having Death Row is that Death Row Records is a record label. We have a roster of artists, of talent, we're thinking that there will be additional people involved under, such as producers and managers and sound engineers, because that all of that work does contribute to the final product of an album, a record, a single, or even some film and TV that we've done under Death Row Pictures. So there's so many different facets of Death Row that are kind of coming together to support each other, which I love being a part of. So yeah, hopefully that gives a good understanding around from start to finish, kind of how and where I got to where I am. But yeah, it's definitely been a little crazy of a ride, and I've enjoyed every moment of it.
Well, first, great problem to have with Snoop religiously calling you to do biz dev and operations management for the cannabis line. Very cool. And 2, you mentioned something that's quite interesting, which is all these kind of supportive factors that comprise Death Row, including in the cannabis realm. And I've always thought, just personally, anecdotally, that cannabis branding can also kind of have this lifestyle aspect of it, right? It's not just about associating a brand with product quality or taste. It really can have a lifestyle impact in how you kind of lead your daily routine. Do you think and see that Death Row is getting into that and supporting it, even if it's got kind of dueling brands on the international scene versus domestic here in the US? Is that something that you see as a potential boon, in that if you're going to smoke our cannabis, you might want to consider our clothing line, and here are our lifestyle and wellness techniques that can match this particular experience? Is that something that you see?
It's definitely been discussed when Snoop did buy the Death Row Records catalog and IP. One of the things that he mentioned to all his managers was how he wanted to move forward with the brand and how it would be different from the 90s and early 2000s image of the brand. And so he wanted to shed the notoriety and uplift not only his artists, but the community that listens and participates in the music and other assets that we put out, like film and TV shows, right? I think the biggest thing that he mentioned was, I want transparency, right? And it's not just business transparency within our unit, but rather for our consumers, what does that look like, right? We're not trying to, specifically for the cannabis space, we are really intent on not selling crazily priced cannabis. we're seeing $70, $80 eighths in jars that honestly don't need to be that much money. And I still remember the days when I'd buy from my guy, like it would be 150 or $200 an ounce. And it was good bud. And we're trying to go back to those days and reminisce around the 90s when death row was big, when I hate saying this, but it is true. Like everyone puts five on it and then you all get to smoke like a 2 gram blunt together. Right. And it's like it's not something where you're really stressing about the money you're putting down, but you're enjoying your time with your friends at house parties, listening to good music. And that's kind of the vibe that we are trying to convey and get people to buy in. Something that one of my head of ops says all the time is we're trying to unboof celebrity weed. And the best thing that I can say about death row cannabis is that Snoop actually smokes it. I literally went to the set of The Voice yesterday and handed him like our newest line of, cured and trimmed weed. And obviously he's always happy to see me, but I think a lot of the reason is because of what I bring as gifts when I do show up, right? So that's something that we couldn't say necessarily about Leafs by Snoop, but Death Row Records cannabis is tried and true, and he smokes it.
I mean, I love to hear it as far as branding goes. What an endorsement, right? To have you actually talk the talk. It's got to help. And, you mentioned part of your role maybe is bringing gifts to set and things like that. But your title is CEO at Death Row Records Cannabis. And on the back of that, what's your toughest job? Because some of these branding companies, even if they've had celebrity backing, there seems to be little business acumen within these communities. It's a lot of kind of handshake deals, not a lot of capability to scale or vision or foresight or tracking of product trends. What's your toughest job right now as CEO?
That's a great question. I would say my toughest job right now is the fact that I have to wear so many hats. We are a pretty flat organization, right? Like my team is 3 people, but I could also say that my team is 115 people because of the way that we structure a lot of our deals. All of our partners do feel like partners. And so even though they might not be under Snoop or in the Snoop camp or world, they have his trust and vice versa, right? We have their trust, they have our trust. And so whether we're talking about our retail partners in Los Angeles or Amsterdam, or our production partners in Michigan, New Mexico, Ohio, and California, they see the vision and they are all in on it. The problem is being able to understand, like I'm doing business development, I'm doing operations, I'm doing negotiations, but I'm also project managing. And I think this comes with a lot of leadership positions. It's difficult to let go, right? And when you do let go, sometimes things thrive, but you have the anxiety of, but I'm not in control. Will it continue doing well? And so that's kind of the hardest part, is being able and feeling confident enough to hand off certain items, whether it's a full business or just something small like, hey, can you draft up this email for me? Is handing those things off to people that I have built trust with over time. So I would say that's probably the most difficult thing. But as we keep growing, we are making sure that we're not overspending. I don't want to name names of other brands or companies, but there have obviously been quite a few nice case studies around raising 8-9 figure investment rounds and then burning through it because they were under the impression that they would always be able to raise more capital. And so there is still something to be said around, austerity and making sure that you're operating within your means and you're able to pay your vendors and your employees. So that is also top of mind, right? So it's making sure that we're not overspending, which is easy to do in this space, but also being able to let go. That's definitely probably one of the hardest things.
And I'm being able to let go, talking about these partnerships, because that to me is key, right? These are the people that are following your specifications. They're in control of quality. You're working closely with them. If there's a recall, you have to deal with them. What makes just a fantastic partner for Death Row? Yeah, like what do you look for? What's the joie de vivre of the partner?
I would say, okay, number one, product quality needs to be there. It needs to be on point. We used to, back when I was working at the management firm, the bottom line was key. And That's fine. But there's another thesis around product first, right? And this comes from when you're doing project management at tech companies. Experience first, right? Like what is it called? UI UX first, experience first, product first. And then the bottom line will come. And so we were intent on making sure that this time around, we didn't launch in Colorado, we didn't launch in Canada or any other territory. We wanted to make sure we were home and that we launched in California where Death Row lives. I wouldn't say he was born, but lives, where Snoop is from and lives, and really brings about that California vibe, and really pressing upon the fact, but also view and image that California grows and has the best cannabis, right? And so we launched in California first, and then what we did was we kept going on afterwards, finding other territories or different things that Snoop and I were interested in getting into. Beverages, the hemp market or the tobacco market, like all these different things that are in and around cannabis, right? When you talk about a good partner, there are different ways to describe great partners. Sometimes there's more involvement, right? Because maybe they're really great at formulating and canning. I'm using beverages as an example, but maybe their branding's not great. Maybe their understanding of marketing and visuals are not the best. So that's where we would come and help supplement, right? And then there's other partners that basically after we sign the contract, we don't talk much and they just execute for us and they just send approvals. Hey, like, is this packaging okay? Hey, is this font okay? We supply them with the assets and then they basically just run with it. And those are really great partners too, because they're self-sufficient, but they also know when to ask for help. And then we are able to address their concerns, I believe, pretty well. So there again, like I said, there's different ways of assessing how a partner is really good. But as long as I would say like no product quality issues is probably the biggest one. We as a company, we have encountered quite a few failed testing for certain batches and we don't put them out. We are very, very, very sure about that and make sure that we don't ever put our customers' health in detriment. And so it's just very interesting to think about what you would call a good partner. So I'm sorry, I don't know if I answered your question, but there are different ways to assess that. Yeah.
No, you definitely did. And it's good to know that there's not one size fits all, because you may be looking for different things out of different partners, different product offerings. And I think the main thing is you really have to analyze what they can provide and what their competencies are. And nobody's going to be a panacea for your branding needs. And kind of on the back of that, because the first question I asked was, what's your toughest job as CEO? What's your easiest job? The job you like the most?
That's great question. I would say, if I ever need a meeting with anybody, there is very, very little resistance. Whether it's from asking a mutual acquaintance or contact or a cold reach out. I remember back in 2014 when I emailed Mark Zecklin from Tweed, or now Canopy. He was the CEO or president. And I literally just emailed hi@tweed.com because that was their catch-all email. And he just couldn't believe that it was, he looked me up, he looked up the management company. He was like, okay, it seems like they're legit, but I still don't believe it. And then only until I went up to Ottawa and met him in real life was he like, okay, this is not a scam. This is legitimate. And it's crazy that like that's one story, but then there's a lot of other stories where it's like, obviously I get a lot of LinkedIn invitations. I'll get a lot of cold emails. I get a lot of bombardment after speeches or panels. But I'm usually, I would say 99% of the time, a pretty open book, and I will always take at least one call. And so the easiest part of my job, I would say, is making connections and finding great people across the board, which then I can utilize as multiple points of due diligence when I'm looking at potential partners, right? Like I make these relationships and I'm like, oh, hey, you're in Arizona or you're in Oklahoma. What do you think about this group? What do you think about that group? Right. And even though all those are maybe anecdotal, once I can get 5 to 10 of those data points, it becomes less anecdotal and more trend. And then that then informs decision making for me and my team.
Got it. What do you think let's say the top 1 to 2 factors are, because now you've been in it for a while, you're obviously approaching the 10-year mark. Congratulations. That make up a more lasting cannabis brand, and then the convex of that. What are maybe 1 to 2 of the pitfalls that would destroy a brand?
Yeah. So I think authenticity is key. And that's why our top tenant is making sure that the man behind the brand fully approves of the products that we are coming out with. He's not an edible guy, he's not a vape guy, but he does try them, right? When I go to Canada and I have different vapes for him, he's like, "Oh, that's peach. Oh, that's a little cherry flavor," right? He'll take a little puff and he'll be like, "I like how that tastes." Where edibles, we usually give him blanks, right? And he'll be like, "I don't like that bite. It's too chewy for me." And then I'll be like, "Okay, well let's look at doing pectin instead of gelatin, right?" And we'll talk through these formulations together separately. So that's authenticity. Another thing that I want to touch on is how cannabis flower is a commodity, like gold or apples, right? But then there is the processed or produced manufactured products. In the same case, I would say maybe applesauce or a gold necklace, right? Those have more value than, maybe not gold, but like those have more lasting value or even shelf space or perceived margin over their initial commodities. And the same is to be said for cannabis, right? Not everyone can do what Kiva and Kana and all these other great brands can do. And so in order to get that same type of or consistent experience, you rely on these brands, right? So I would say for the brands that are focused on more of the manufactured products, consistency is key. And I think a lot of those companies have been able to dial that in because the processing manufacturing process is extremely easy to make sure that your SOPs are fully consistent, right? When it comes to a flower brand, I feel like, and this is still getting meted out, right? It's not, we're still shaking out. It's not like this is the winning solution. But when it comes to the actual commodity side of things, like the flower and the raw product, I would say, yes, consistency is key, but you're not going to get that. Seasons change, whether it's, if you're doing outdoor mixed light or greenhouse, the indoor conditions, as much as you'd like to say they're always the same, they are not. And so consistency is key, but I would say the promise of what you are putting in your package to the consumer stays consistent. That's the consistent point. So like maybe the flower this month is not the same as the flower next month on shelf, but as long as what the consumer is expecting is the same as what you are giving them, like brand identity versus brand image, as long as those don't have a large discrepancy, I think that's the solution or the success of a great lasting cannabis brand.
And what about the evils, the pitfalls?
Yeah. I would say the the pitfalls I would say include, this sounds so silly, but when your intentions at the top or even at management level are not great. There have been, I'm not going to call them out, but there have been multiple times where certain CEOs or managers have been caught saying certain things around smaller brands or not paying AP, and that those are bad actors in our space. And there are bad actors in almost every space. What the reason why you're seeing so many now in cannabis is because we're still a relatively nascent industry that is perceived to be able to be taken advantage of. And so as long as you're able to figure out which ones are the bad actors, and I'll tell you straight up, I'm not the best at it, right? Like I'm a very friendly, gregarious person. And if someone reciprocates that to me, I usually am like, great. Then I start asking around and people are like, oh yeah, he's a con man, or like, oh yeah, don't believe her, right? Then that's what gives me the insight into how to make sure not to move. But the problem with the pitfalls of a brand are when the people behind the brand start saying things that don't necessarily align with the brand itself. And again, those might not have been on the record, but they still get leaked, and you just got to watch and make sure that you're living the ethos of the brand that you're trying to represent.
Yeah, I would say cannabis is still rife with the concept of caveat emptor, buyer beware, and it's all the way around because of its infancy, even though it has been around for 10 plus years. Because of federal illegality, there is a perception that bad actors have it easier. If you're violating one law, you have a license to violate other laws and you treat people accordingly. So that one I completely understand, even as a lawyer in deciding who to take on as a client, it's the same evaluation, you know.
Yeah. I can't even imagine that process for you guys because I don't think about taking on partnerships based off of whether or not they're obviously we do the due diligence, like reputation's important and all that, but your checklist or your due diligence is probably very different than mine or other brands, right? So that's really interesting to hear a perspective on too.
I'd love to compare our BS radars because together we might make the perfect watchtower in the cannabis industry. Okay, couple more questions while I have you. And just quickly, this is kind of an easy one. Do you have a favorite state in which Death Row operates, and how has it been in California? California's pretty rough right now. It's been pretty flat. That's no secret. But do you have a favorite state that you operate in otherwise?
I do not. I think each state has its own. It's fun to see like Ohio, right? Ohio is just turning recreational after voting less than a year ago. And so that's fun to see, right? Whereas Michigan is one of the largest markets, which is also great to see, comparing its growth to California's stagnant growth over the last couple years. And I'm also from the Midwest, so that's fun to see as well. But then you look at and we're not in some of these territories, but it's again really interesting to see how Nevada does what they're doing, and not that they're gangster or anything, but it's fun to see how like the gaming commission is being replicated in the cannabis world, and how like the big players are all posturing and lobbying to make sure certain things do or don't happen. For example, like intoxicating hemp not being allowed to be sold there. But then there's states like Oklahoma, which are like free reign for all, right? Like everyone gets a license. You want a license? It's like Oprah giving out everyone a car or something. But then there's Arizona, where it's like you only have 170, 160 physical locations. And then their structure is so different, right? Because it's like everything leads up to the license, which is only the retail. So it's just like, it's really cool to see how every state is trying to do certain things, and then seeing how other states are necessarily modeling after previous states that have legalized. I would say California is definitely tough. It is the market that we are most familiar with, but non payment is the biggest issue, right? When you go from the bottom of the supply chain up, and then you see that the producers, the brands, the whatever are not getting paid because the retailers are getting taxed out the wazoo and then can't write certain things off, then that gets up to, distribution, up to processing, and then a lot of things don't get paid. So of the 5 to 800 stores in California, like 90% of them are on a list that we have crowdsourced from some distributors of being less than desirable or bad credit, right? Meaning they have 90 plus days of AR that has not been paid. And so we don't sell to them. We have that list. It gets updated every 6 months or so. We're technically getting it from piecemeal from a bunch of different places, data and all that stuff from an analytics company, as well as personal relationships that we have in the space. We get a lot of comments where it's like, why are you guys not in more doors? And there's a reason why. We're being very careful. We are a new brand. And given what I said earlier on our podcast, Hillary, about, that leak about that CEO saying like, we just don't pay new brands because they're going to be out of business in a year. We don't want to sell to those bad actors, right? We want to work with retailers that see the vision and want to support and want to make sure that everyone's winning in the space, right? So that I would say is my assessment of how California is. We're doing well, right? Like we did a Tupac drop recently that sold out in like less than 10 days, and the attention is there. The problem is just, hopefully with any rescheduling, descheduling, or whatever else, the taxation element can go away, which then would help a lot of both top and bottom line for the bottom of the supply chain to then distribute upwards. So hopefully that happens, but we're in that midst of restructuring for, I think, the whole state and maybe even the whole country.
Yeah. California's a pain point, which is disappointing because it's so big and diverse and it really should be leading the way, but it's got its own problems. And how many stores do you think Death Row is in at this point, national?
I'll have to double check with AK, but I think we're maybe in like 50 right now.
In just California or nationally?
Just California, yeah. In Michigan, I think we're at about 80. And then in Canada, we're in like 3 or 400. So that's because it's a national program, right? So it's a lot easier to make things happen on a national level than what's happening in the United States.
I hear you. Okay, Tiffany, last question. You've been so obliging and generous. What final advice and parting words would you give to cannabis companies and or brand builders about getting into the cannabis space right now, 2024?
Yeah, it's tough. It is a hard space to get into. I would say doing a lot of market research about what is out there and then focusing on where there is white space. So I've seen strategies from certain brands that only focus on chocolate edibles, right? Like they don't do gummies, they don't do anything else. They just do chocolate edibles and they do them so well. And that's like they're pointy, they own that spot and they crush the market in that way, right? And so with that, they're able to then shy away from the whole idea that we're an edible company. They can really focus on the facts of the chocolate that's going in there and really kind of dial into that sort of road of branding. When I think about other companies that have done different things, like maybe a large swath of products, the exercise really is around brand identity. So I think I've said this a couple of times during the call, but the reason why a lot of brands might not be seen as super favorable, and I'm not just talking about cannabis, but overall, is that there is a discrepancy between brand identity and brand image. So a brand identity is when the people who own the brand or are putting out the products, what they think about the brand, right? So let's take Walmart, for example. The Waltons might be like, Walmart's a great place for people to shop for families. It's cheap. It's great. You can buy everything all at one place. And it's like, it's great, right? Whereas the brand image, which is what the consumers see or feel about the brand, might be like, Walmart is cheap. Walmart is cheap, could be good or bad, right? Walmart is a place where maybe lower income people go. I don't want to be seen at Walmart, right? So there's clearly a discrepancy between the brand image and brand identity, which needs to be squashed. Because once that discrepancy becomes zero or close to it, then what you are messaging is being perceived the way you want it to be messaged. And so I think that would be the biggest thing is get the brand out there, obviously do all the legwork around ideation and what you think the industry needs. But then after 3-6 months, do some what are they called? Focus groups, do some surveys, do some thought process analysis around what your consumers think about your product. And there's so many different branding exercises that you can do to help bridge that gap between image and identity. And so for us, I'm standing on the shoulders, I'm literally with the man right now, but I'm standing on the shoulders of a brand that's 30 years old. So the brand image and identity are pretty solid. And I'm very fortunate that I didn't have to build and grow this brand, that it's been in music for 30 years. It's been in and around really globally famous artists for 3 decades. And so it's easy for me to say this, but hopefully there's some advice here that some of the listeners can apply.
Well, there you have it, dear listener. Just because it's federally illegal does not mean that brand image and identity have to be mutually exclusive. And you've heard it from the top with Tiffany Chen at Death Row Records Cannabis. Tiffany, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you.
And that concludes today's episode of the Cannabis Law Now podcast. Until next time, stay alert, stay alive.